Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. It's been lovely hearing all the presentations so far. As has been mentioned, I'm here. My name is Jawad and I'm here with my colleague Nikki. And we'll be talking about the workshop that we held with young people of colour around the impact of racism and the impact of that on their mental health as well. So I'm Jawad. I'm advising the Emerging Minds Voice Powers and Attitudes kind of look into racism on young people's mental health. And I'm here with my colleague Nikki, who's going to introduce herself as well.
Hi everyone. Yes, I'm also an advisor to the Emerging Minds Network, as well as the Institute of Mental Health at Nottingham with the Young People's Advisory Group, and just generally a mental health advocate as well as a coach.
Thank you, Nikki. So just going into what we did within our workshop. So we invited young people of colour between the ages of 16 to 25 to share their views. So the two particular areas we wanted to look into: how is their experience of racism felt in the UK? So a lot of the research looked into experience of racism in the US. So we kind of wanted to clarify and really understand their experience. And then we looked at how it affected their mental health as well. Just to go into the demographics a little bit, just before we head into the themes that we've found. So the ages that were represented were 17 to 25. And then the ethnicities that we had was Black and Asian, and we had both genders represented, but there were, of course, more males. So we had 5 Black males, 1 Asian female, and 1 Asian male as well.
So we kicked off the event with the young people by just asking them what they felt was most at the forefront of their minds when they think about how young people are affected by racism. And we got some fairly typical responses or rankings, with the first one being the media response to Black Lives Matter. That's what young people identified as the issue that affected them the most in terms of racism. But then also some common responses such as stop and search, the school to prison pipeline, as well as the quality of Black history education in schools, among other things.
So the first part that we wanted to look into was the experience of racism in the UK. So the question we were trying to answer in this part was, in what way do children and young people in the UK experience racism?
So the first way, so we identified some overarching themes to young people's responses, as well as some sub-themes. And here are some of the quotes that we've managed to pull out. So the first main theme we identified was stereotypes and public perception. Young people felt that they felt victims of being feared by strangers. And so in addition to the quote that we have on the slides, young people also expressed that it was normal for them to have Uber drivers driving away and refusing them service, as well as being followed around in stores. And as we can see, as the quote on the screen says, every time someone goes to the shop, they have to kind of perform to prove their innocence, even though they've not done anything wrong. Secondly, stop and search as well as over-policing. Young people felt that police harassment is a big issue amongst people of colour, and they felt especially that Black people were targeted the most. And we have another quote, not on the slides, but one participant reported that if you go to a school that has majority Black and brown people, you'll be assigned a police officer that the white school down the road doesn't, despite despite their participation in similar illicit behaviours such as drugs. And finally, young people felt that there was a negative portrayal of Black culture and Black history in media, and they felt as though what they see on their screens and what they hear in schools when Black history is taught doesn't focus on the positives, only magnifies the negatives.
Then we found on a broader level the idea of systematic and institutional racism. So under this, we kind of thought about the disparities and discrimination that the young people talked about. So I think one big thing that came from it was this idea that young people of color and people of color in general are overrepresented in crisis, but they are underrepresented in prevention. So quite often you find it when it gets to the more extreme stages of dealing with a lot of mental health conditions and issues and struggles. It often it happens that it gets right to the end point before anything is done about it. So there's a big question around why it gets to that point. Why is it that we are found in these particular areas? The second thing was the school to prison pipeline. So the fact that the system was giving up on a lot of young people of color when they were going through difficult times, when they're finding hard times being excluded from school. And there was a sense that the system was failing them. It wasn't doing enough to help them out and help them deal with those particular crises that they were having personally and issues that they were having. So that was also something else that was felt. And finally, an idea that the awareness and sensitivity around racism in the UK isn't felt as much compared to the places, for example, in the US. It's a lot different. The experience is a lot more hidden. It's not talked about as much. So finding the words to talk about your experience can be a lot more difficult. And sometimes when the young people were talking about it, it felt like they weren't able to explain it in a way that was tangible, and they found it hard to describe it because it is not as upfront.
Thirdly, representation and tokenism was an issue that young people identified. Firstly, that there is a lack of meaningful representation, whether that's in the policy making process, the decision making process, it's just not there for them. And with that, they felt that when there are attempts made at offering representation, they don't hold much weight, kind of in the manner of Zora Neale Hurston's quote, "All skin folk ain't kinfolk," where young people felt that those given as representatives of the community don't actually represent their interests. And so it just continues this sense that there's just lip service being given. And even where there are attempts at offering representation that perhaps aren't tokenistic, they lack the adequate resources to have much influence or make change in the policies. So in short, the young people felt that representation without proper support doesn't really work.
Yeah. And then moving on to the second part of our workshop, so we want to look at the impact of the racism that they had experienced and what that meant for their mental health. So the question we were trying to answer for this part is, what impact are these experiences having on you and your friends? So one of the biggest things that came from this was this idea and themes around identity, belonging, and self-esteem. So, for example, self-perception was something that was felt to really affect young people, because when the narrative and the storyline is that these being from being a person from a different background compared to what is the majority in this country, you do feel like you are different, that you are persecuted and you are attacked. It will damage your perception of not only yourself but of others too. So that was a big thing that came from that. And then talking about imposter syndrome as well, so feeling like you don't belong, and you don't belong in the environment that you're in. You often feel like you stand out, you feel like you're a thorn amongst other things. So that was a big thing that was felt. And alongside that, it was this idea that you had to be more than to fit in. You had to be excellent, you had to go above and beyond, and you had to overcompensate. So this was a big demand on feeling about who you are. And finally, it was the story about othering as well, this feeling of othering and feeling like you're different from everyone else in this country. So with the Windows scandal that happened quite recently, so these are people who came to this country after World War II, helped build it up, and yet they were being sent back to different countries, even though they had built a life here and they had built the country up. So this storyline of that you don't belong was one of the biggest things that came from that. And the most recent another recent example was the backlash to the Sainsbury's advert that happened over Christmas, where they showed a black family in an advert, and there was one young person in one of the groups who kind of emphasized how that had made him feel like he just didn't belong, when other people are saying that this is not a representative kind of picture of what Britain is, even though there is a significant population of Black people in the UK, there was still this backlash, which just kind of in this day and age just felt like it was just not representative of what it should be.
Young people also expressed that they felt a sense of loneliness and social isolation, both as a result of just a general feeling of social rejection. And one young person felt as though they are always thinking about either white people do not like them, or they are trying to overcompensate and like him just because he's Black. And there was also a sense of being misunderstood on the part of young people, where an Asian female Muslim participant described feeling uncomfortable because no one in her classes wanted to talk to her, and the counselor that she was referred to by her university, during one of the sessions, she was interrupted and told that it's got nothing to do with the way she dresses, even nobody's looking at you. And that was something that didn't sit well with her, because the participant hadn't made any mention of her clothes, because she didn't feel it was an insecurity for her. So just that insensitivity, unfortunately, had an adverse effect on this young person, who experienced a mental health crisis after that point, especially as a result of encountering the place that they're going for help making things worse. Which points to the general lack of support that young people feel when it comes to dealing with racism, both in terms of systems, so whether that's people who are migrants or refugees, having to figure out how to overcome language barriers in order to get their needs met, or whether it's on an individual level, as one young person told a story about his experience at a theme park where he was made to feel embarrassed due to comments made about his ethnic heritage that did not sit well with him, and no one came to his defense in the moment.
And then looking at self-protection, palatability, and performance is one of the themes that came up when we were looking at how racism affects their mental health and what they have to do. So just the idea of authenticity, having to feel like you have to present in different ways, in different situations, and there is this really big pressure on you to do so. Although it may feel like a natural thing to do, where we are different in different situations, but there is this really big kind of expectation that you have to do this. So one example was a young person who said that they had to feel like they had to dress differently just to go to the shops, because they were worried about looking a certain way. So they had to make sure that they didn't look like go out all dressed in black, because they had to make sure that they looked like they weren't going to be stealing, for example. So those are the things that really kind of stood out. So the adapting behavior, having to feel like you have to do that. So one of the quotes mentioned in here, of course, is from a young age, I've been told to do certain things, like how to enter a situation, like if police do stop and search. So that was a very, very big thing. And finally, exceptionalism as well, having to do more, make twice the effort just to make people feel comfortable around you, or make them believe that you're good enough for the role when you are going for a job, for example. So having to build up and have a higher expectation, and like have to meet a higher standard beyond what is expected of other people. That was a big kind of feeling that was felt, and how that was affecting their mental health too.
And finally, some other effects of racism that came up were how it can impact young people's decision-making process. For example, when it comes to making decisions about their careers, young people often find themselves having to make decisions whether or not they'll take up a job based on how racist the environment is, or having to tolerate dehumanizing circumstances, which is something that they feel that they have to often put up with because of their financial circumstances. But secondly, family relationships. So for example, racism can have an indirect impact on how parents raise their children. For example, parents might expect or encourage their children to water themselves down in order to protect themselves, so that they don't go through the same things that they experienced. But then also racism can impact friendships, both in terms of creating rifts amongst young people of color who experience maybe a crab mentality, as they feel there's there has to be competition because only a few of them can make it. And then also, that's rivalries within ethnic communities, but then also the rifts across cultural communities where insensitive comments might be made by their white counterparts, for example, and that can create tension in their relationships.
Yeah. So then once we looked at all of this, there are young people who were talking about what we should do about it, and we really wanted to highlight the solutions to what these are. So one of the first things that came up was just really understanding how racism is felt in the UK in particular. So as mentioned, a lot of the research around racism is based in the US. So trying to really grasp that, and this is definitely something that the Voice, Power and Attitudes project is trying to understand. Then thinking about co-designing solution and having lived experience advisors. So these were two things that the young people did feel like was a very big thing that needed to happen when finding solutions, because this was their experience and they want to make sure that they were also a part of it. So there is this big appetite to get involved, to have their voices heard and make services work for them. So then coming to appropriate and geared services. So if you do have those particular things above, we can create services that are really focused on these particular things, and also having the authentic and meaningful engagement. So making sure we're not just doing this because we're required to, or because we're just trying to tick a box, but making sure that we're actually taking this very seriously, and making sure that the solutions and what comes out of it does fit the situation, because different situations will differ through communities across the UK in itself. So it's really important to make sure that this engagement is meaningful and authentic. So I want to thank you so much for listening. There has been a lot of information, and hopefully you will benefit from the information that we have kind of provided today. Thank you so much.